Hey guys, Chaps here, and let's talk about control schemes. Over the years, I've seen a ton of questions about control schemes and various controller settings. Today, I wanted to take a look at the various configurations that we have in Gears 5 and evaluate the pros and cons of each. Tomorrow, I'll go through some more of the advanced options, and then on Wednesday, I'm going to talk about how sensitivities work and go into some details about what goes into dialing things in properly. Lastly, on Thursday, I'll discuss what I feel to be an ideal control scheme. Let's go ahead and start out by looking at the default control scheme. This is kind of the standard that I'll be comparing most things to, being, well, it's the default scheme. And that kind of highlights what the main positive point of this scheme is, and that's that everyone is used to it. It's not really that complicated, and people have used it for years. We're comfortable with it, and it's a pain to learn new stuff. As true as that may be, it's kind of a cop-out. The default scheme will always be the most used in any game. So let's try to see what else makes it worth using. This brings us to the A button. The three main movement commands, roll, run, and cover, are all mapped to this one button. This greatly simplifies things by allowing us to simply and fluidly transition between most movement commands without constantly changing buttons. What's funny though is that this one main positive aspect of the control scheme is also its downfall. Having all three movement commands mapped to A may make things simple, but it also leads to three main issues. We'll begin with the location of the A button. Basically, if you want to press this, you need to take your hand off of the right stick. When rolling, this isn't really a huge issue because the animation takes a while, and when roadie running, this also isn't a huge issue because most of the camera controls are easy enough to do while running. When interacting with cover though, this can really throw things off. With Gears being such a movement-heavy game, it isn't ideal to take your hands off of either stick, especially not for anything movement-related. Speaking of this movement-heavy aspect, what's the one thing that's interrupted your movement more than anything? That's right, the dreaded misroll. As you're bouncing around, if you're not aligned properly, you're probably going to end up rolling. Not only does this often result in someone getting an easy kill on you, but even if it didn't cause someone to kill you, your flow is now completely messed up and you need to recover. Having all three of these commands on the same button certainly simplifies things, but it has also led to the demise of some great players. The third flaw with the A button on the default scheme is the input delay. This has been present in all Gears games, but it really just started being discussed more in the Gears 5 timeframe. Let's look at how these commands work. As you press down the button, what are you trying to do? Well, the game knows that you're either trying to run, roll, or slide to cover, but which one is it? If you're aligned with cover, that's surely what you want to do, right? Well, not really. Perhaps you actually want to roadie run. Same goes for if you're not aligned with cover. The game doesn't know if you want to roll or run. On the default scheme, none of the A commands actually activate upon button press. What actually happens is that some of the actions take place upon release of the button. You can test this out yourself by pressing A and then holding it for half a second or so before releasing it. It's very noticeable that you roll or slide to cover when you release, not when you press it. Why is this though? Well, let's say that it was on press. You press A and it determines that you should roll or slide to cover, and that can happen instantly. But what if you keep holding the button because you actually want it to run? Well, you'd end up with some janky animation of your character getting halfway through a roll and then transitioning into a run, or something similar with halfway through sliding to cover and then transitioning to a run. Not only would this look super strange on your screen, but just imagine what it would look like for other players online. This is probably also a good time to add that there's a significant delay on the roadie run ability. A lot of people talk about the micro delay over cover and rolling, and rightfully so, as they're more important commands. But it's funny how everyone has just sort of accepted the fact that roadie run has such a long delay. Imagine if any other video game had this sort of wait before running. There's a solution to all of this delay stuff though, and I'll be hitting on that shortly, so stay tuned. In the meantime, let's take a look at another negative aspect of the default control scheme, and that's the fact that reload and alt-fire are on the same button. RB makes sense for the GL. It allows you to keep aiming while holding down the button. When you think about it, it doesn't even seem like it's that much of an issue for the retrocharge or the chainsaw. But in practice, it's just not living up to things. On a fairly subjective note, most people aren't too happy with the change that the Coalition made by taking Chainsaw and Retro off of the B button. But the more serious issue is simply how buggy it is on RB and how often it causes you to jam your gun. Perhaps this is something the Coalition can change, but right now it really isn't cutting it. Well, that basically covers the default scheme. It has a few nice positive notes, but overall it seems to have a decent number of negatives. We move now on to the alternate scheme, which was introduced in Gears 2. Basically, this takes the evade or roll command as well as roadie run and moves it over to the X button. All of the X button commands from default are now moved up to Y, which was largely unused on default. I'll also note that expressions are still on the press of the right stick, just like default, and the arcade menu and ultimate abilities are by pressing LB and RB at the same time. The only reason I bring these up specifically is because the Coalition decided to leave these out on their in-game screenshots of all the control schemes. Because of oversights like these though, all of the images that you're going to see in this video are ones that we custom made, so hopefully they're more accurate. Let's go ahead and jump into the positive notes about this control scheme. Basically, all of the positives here stem from the separation of the cover command. This accomplishes three main things. First, you'll no longer have the accidental rolls that you had with default. The two commands that were on release were roll and cover. Being these are now separated onto two buttons, we no longer need to worry about accidentally rolling when trying to slide to cover. Next, we have the removal of the delay when sliding to cover. Cover and rotary run are no longer on the same button. This changes our flowchart. As you can see, for A, we no longer need to evaluate if the player is holding it down. It's as simple as, are they facing cover or not, and then the action can happen instantly. We'll cycle back to the right side of this chart in a minute. This removal of delay on cover slides is a great benefit of separating cover from rotary run, but the benefit doesn't stop there. Not only is there no longer a delay, but you're now able to spam the cover button while running. Sliding is often faster than running, so the sooner you're able to slide into cover, the better off you'll be. Imagine that you're running across the map heading towards some cover. On default, if you wanted to slide, you need to let go of run and press cover. You have a slight delay due to letting go, and then another slight one because the cover command needs to wait for release to activate. To make things worse, on default, if you're slightly out of range of cover, you're now going to roll, thus leaving you exposed. With alternate, you can keep holding down X to run and then simply press A repeatedly as you approach the cover. The instant you press A and you're within range of the cover, you'll transition into a slide. Because of this, alternate has the potential to be the control scheme that allows for the fastest navigation around the map. Not everything is perfect though, so let's look at some cons. To begin with, we still have the issue of needing to take your right thumb off of the stick in order to press the movement commands. We also have the fact that cover and run are now separate buttons. I just finished saying how this can lead to the fastest movement in the game, but be that as it is, it still makes things less fluid in terms of button presses. There just seems to be something awkward about constantly swapping back and forth between the two buttons. Probably the most noticeable instance of this for me would be when trying to up A around a corner. You used to be able to be in cover and press forward, then hold A. You'd just run around the cover and keep running. If you do that now, you'll run around cover and just stop. You need to hold forward, press A, go around cover, but then switch over to X in order to continue running. It's something that many have grown used to, but I just feel this to be a negative aspect of this game. Jumping back to our flowchart, we'll need to hit on that right side. Separating out cover commands help a lot, but the whole run versus roll issue still exists. For that reason, roll still initiates upon release and run still initiates after a long hold. I'll also add that just as with default, this scheme also has alt-fire and reload on the same button. Again, probably not the biggest issue, but it's certainly resulted in many unnecessary deaths. The last negative to bring up for alternate is the combo of LB and RB to use your ultimate or bring up some of the menus like in arcade. This again isn't really a huge issue, but it will occasionally be annoying. If your timing on pressing them isn't spot on, you may accidentally reload or something like that. Overall, this control scheme has a few upsides compared to default, and some pretty minor downsides. If you're willing to learn a new scheme and want to squeeze out as much potential as possible, then this may be for you. If you're more of a casual gamer like me, the potential gains from this probably aren't worth it, and you may want to stick with default. Or if you're feeling up to it, perhaps this next one will be of interest to you. We arrive now at Defaulternate. This isn't actually an official controller scheme, it's just a community-made remapping of alternate to make it more similar to default. So we're going to start with the alternate scheme, and then we're going to go into controller remapping. Change X to A, and change Y to X. Your screen should look like this. If you have any questions about remapping, check back tomorrow, I'll be sure to hit on that in more detail. Note that your controller layout screen won't change to reflect this, but like I said earlier, we made our own screens, so here's how it will actually function. Also note that here you can't remap the combo of RB and LB, so you're stuck with having your ultimate and arcade menu on that combo. Besides that though, this basically looks a lot like default, so why would anyone use this over default? Well, I'm glad you asked. Like I said, it looks just like default, so it has that going for it. It's very familiar to people. This also means that all of the movement is now mapped to a single button again, thus making it easier on your fingers. The true change though comes from the fact that we now have no delay on the cover actions. Let's hop back to our handy flowchart. The change that's taken place is that we've basically removed the check for are we holding A when evaluating the cover actions. When we remapped the buttons, the game put the remapped ones at a lower priority. If we hadn't remapped anything, cover would be the only option, and that's still the top priority. If there's no cover to slide to though, then it goes in and looks at the lower priority actions. So yeah, basically this functions exactly like default, but if you press A and you're near cover, you'll slide to it on press rather than release. While that's nice, it also starts to lead us into some of the cons of the system. Being that the cover now takes priority over evades and running, the walls may feel a bit sticky. Let's say I'm standing here and I want to start running this way. Well, if I press and hold A, like I want to run, it's going to cause me to slide to cover, being that that has priority. Alternatively, if I was on default, it would wait to see if I wanted to run, and then let me do so. This is a pretty minor issue though, because I imagine most of the time people aren't going to be trying to run when sliding is an option. And that's really the only new con to this system. It still carries some cons over from both alternate and default though. You still need to move your hand off of the right stick in order to use movement commands. You'll still have a delay on rolling and running. Those stupid RB interruptions will still exist. And lastly, you may accidentally reload when trying to activate your ultimate. All in all, this is a pretty solid control scheme though. It's basically functioning exactly like default, but with no cover delay and potentially feeling a bit stickier. This has become an extremely popular control scheme in 2020, and I would strongly suggest people look into making the change. Before we get ahead of ourselves though, let's not forget about tournament controls. These entered the game starting with Ultimate Edition, and it's actually what I used to use for quite a while. Here's default, and here's tournament. Spot the difference? Yeah, that's it. It's basically just swapping LB and A. The key negative aspect of all the schemes that I've discussed so far is that in order to use any of the movement commands, you'll need to take your hand off of the right stick. This simple swap of LB and A has basically solved that for us. It's still very close to the default scheme and keeps everything on one button. I can't emphasize enough how important movement is in Gears. Taking your hand off of that right stick for even a split second can and will slow you down. For that reason alone, I feel this scheme beats out all of the other ones we've discussed so far. What cons does it bring with it though? Well, for starters, if you're someone who loves to use Tac-Com, it's now on A, which may take some getting used to. I personally use it constantly, and I remember needing to ease off of it and use it much less when I had it down on A. We also have the same issues that were present with default. Cover, roll, and run now all have delays and potential misrolls, and those aggravating RB interruptions are still present. Would I recommend this scheme? Absolutely. Like I said, I used to use it for quite a while. That said, if you're willing to make this change, I think these next two schemes may be a better fit. We'll start with Tournament Alternate. For this, we simply use Alternate Control Scheme and swap LB and A. Your screen should look something like this, and as usual, here's a custom mock-up of what the controls would be like. Note that cover is now on LB, but we still have roll and run on X. I'll also add that some like to swap X and A here when they do this. I won't go too in depth on all the pros and cons here, as we've basically covered the details of them already, but let's take a look at them quickly. The pros of this system are that we no longer have misrolls, no delay for cover actions, and potentially the fastest navigation of any scheme. And then obviously we also now have the main perk of Tournament, being that you don't need to take your finger off of the right stick to do cover actions. So while it's not ideal to have roll and run on the face buttons, it's certainly preferable over having these switched like this. For cons, we have the usual. Just as I mentioned, roll and run have a delay and require you to move off of the right stick. It's also sometimes awkward having the run and cover commands separated. This still has the potential reload issue with that LB-RB combo, and who could forget the RB interruptions. And lastly, as a result of using tournament controls, Tac-Com is on a face button, thus making it a bit less convenient. Overall, I'd say this is a pretty solid scheme, and I'd pick it over Alternate. This next one takes the cake for me though. We move now to Tournament Defaulternate. Let's get this remapping out of the way. X becomes LB, A becomes LB, Y goes to X, and LB goes to A. Here's what your screen will look like, and here's what that end result will get you. As usual, let's begin with the positive notes of this system. Movement on one button? Check. No need to take hand off of aiming stick for any movement commands? Check. No delay for cover? Check. And to top things off, it's extremely similar to default. For cons, well, we obviously still have the annoying delay for rolling and running. We still haven't been able to avoid that. Due to cover taking priority, we now also have that more sticky feeling, but I don't think that will be an issue. And yup, you guessed it, RB interruptions and accidental reloads when trying to activate the ultimate. Overall, I'd say this is probably my favorite potential scheme in the game. I personally use an Elite controller, which I'll hit on a bit tomorrow, but if I wasn't, I'm pretty sure this is the route I would be taking. We move now to what is arguably the strangest control scheme in the game, and this of course is Face Trigger. From what I can tell, this is basically only in place as an accessibility option. All it does is swap Y with LT and swaps X with RT. This isn't convenient for really anything unless there's some physical limitation. If you use this or you know someone who uses this, please let me know. I'm curious about this one. I'm also going to note that it's odd that this is even an option. We have the ability to remap buttons in-game, so it seems kind of pointless to me, but whatever. I'm not going to go through all the pros and cons on this one. The cons are essentially too numerous to count, and I really only recommend using this as a special case. Let's move now to the newest and last of the official control schemes. This, of course, is Shooter, which had a lot of people really excited, and also has a lot of people really confused. I'll throw the scheme up on screen here. Once again, this is a custom-made one because for some reason the Coalition likes putting incomplete images in the game. They forgot to mention that the Ultimate and Arcade menu is on Y, and emotes use a combination of LB and RB. In case you haven't noticed by now, this is completely different than anything we've ever seen in Gears. This all stems from the Coalition wanting to create a control scheme that separates out the three main movement commands. Sure, this may make controls a bit annoying for long-time players, but just look at what it does to this flowchart. Look simple? Yeah, it is. Not only that, but you may have noticed that there's no more holding required. We now have all three actions happen on press rather than release or on hold. Just let that sink in. No delays. Like on roll or cover, I don't see that being a huge deal. Sure, no delay is nice, but the delays we've dealt with for years are almost negligible. Roadie running, on the other hand, that was a significant delay, and now it's entirely gone. It's hard to convey through video, so if you haven't already tried it out, I seriously suggest you go look into this. Something else that's special about this split of movement controls is that both run and cover are left-handed buttons. You can still keep your right hand on the aiming stick while doing these controls. Unfortunately, roll still requires the face button, but again, that animation takes a while, so it's not as high priority as something like cover. I also want to add that just as with alternate, we have cover and run on separate buttons, thus allowing it to be the fastest navigation control scheme. If we combine this with the fact that running has no delay, then I hate to say it, but honestly, this might be the fastest control scheme. It's also nice that we no longer have the RB interruptions. On RB, we have marking targets and alt fire. These are both things that you do while pointing towards targets, so it makes perfect sense to have them near trigger spots. Potentially even more important though is the fact that we'll no longer jam reloads while trying to do alt fires. They finally made a control scheme that gets rid of that. This is all nice though, but is it all worth it? Let's look at some of the downsides to this system. Sticking with that RB theme, the scheme has actually moved reload down to X to put it in line with many classic games. This isn't a huge deal at first, but when you start considering the active reload mechanic, this seems quite annoying and is probably one of the biggest turnoffs. We move next on to the way of roadie run functions. Again, it's fantastic that it has no delay, but it also brings its downsides. Something that may not seem super obvious at first is that you can no longer do a 180 when starting your run. This was only possible due to the delay, and being the delay is gone, it's simply not possible anymore. I didn't really use that 180 run very much, so in my mind it's not a huge loss, but some people may care. What is a big loss in my mind though is the fact that roadie running now activates on press and doesn't deactivate when you release it. All you need to do is tap the stick in and you'll keep running. That's how most games are, but Gears isn't most games. We have intricate cover and movement mechanics. It's really annoying trying to run between cover and having it constantly trying to keep running on you. You basically need to pull back on the stick in order to stop running. What this essentially leads to is that if you're running and you want to stop, you need to come to a halt. There's no going from running to walking. It's run to stop to walk. If that doesn't sound bad to you, I suggest you give it a try, especially when running up on an enemy. The last downside I want to mention here is simply how significant of a change it is. Many of us have been playing Gears for years now, and this is just too much of a change for me to process. Not only has it remapped buttons, but it's also swapped around combos of which two actions are together on the same button. This was really an interesting experiment that TC did, and I applaud them for trying. It's just not something that most gearheads will want to deal with. Pro players trying to squeeze every inch of potential out may find this useful, and new players who haven't gained muscle memory yet may enjoy this. It's just not for me. While this scheme doesn't really seem to fit me well, I definitely see some positives from it, and I know many wanted to give it a try. I spent some time the other day trying to come up with various button remappings, and this is what I came up with. We'll remap LB to A, the left stick to A, RB to left stick, X to RB, and A to LB. This is what our control scheme ends up looking like. This is basically a shooter alternate. If you're going to go this far though, I'd argue that you may be better off with a tournament shooter alternate. Left stick goes to LB, RB goes to left stick, and X goes to RB. Here's a quick scroll through of that. And yeah, this is basically what we're left with. I originally tried this with also putting B on the left bumper so that you would have all three movements together. Unfortunately, the game didn't really seem to like that and wouldn't allow you to ever roll. So what are our pros and cons here? Well, for starters, I only played like this for 30 minutes or so I imagine that I'm probably missing some stuff, but here's what stuck out. Now we clearly have the advantage of shooter where there's no delay on cover, roll, or run. Here's a quick glimpse at what our new flowchart looks like. As you can see, by pressing B, we will instantly do a roll, no need to wait for a release. And on LB, it's as simple as determining if you're facing cover or not. Again, no waiting for holds or releases. Another advantage here is that we've brought run and cover onto the same button. This helps minimize the necessity for button changes, and I feel like it just keeps things more fluid. Something special that occurs only on the shooter control scheme is the fact that the roadie run button doesn't need to be held. I mentioned previously how using shooter allows for the fastest movement in the game. Well, this control scheme sticks with that theme, but now has the commands on one button. So this game is now technically the fastest movement scheme and keeps run and cover on the same button. That's pretty cool. You'll also note that alt-fire and reload are separated still. This means you'll no longer get those accidental jams when trying to chainsaw. All in all, this scheme seems to have a lot going for it, but what are the downsides? Well, if we stick with the movement discussion for now, we have a few of the issues for the standard shooter control scheme. You can't do the 180 turn, which again I don't care about, but more importantly, and I can't stress this enough, roadie run doesn't stop when you let go. Like, this is probably the main turnoff for this scheme. Just as with Defaulternate or Tournament Defaulternate, we now have mapped cover and run onto the same button with no delay. While it's nice to not have the delay on either, it once again will make the walls sticky, which isn't exactly ideal. A strange con to this mode, which I don't think we've seen yet, is that you can't emote with it. I've tried pressing all of the unmapped and remapped button combos, but it just doesn't seem to work. My guess is that when remapping stuff there's some priority issues, so pressing LB and RB at the same time just isn't registering. Another thing that I'll list as a con here is the alt-firing position. It's on the left stick, and I mean, it's honestly not that bad. It just takes some getting used to. The last thing that I'll bring up is something that feels kinda strange when you first notice it, but I don't think it's gonna really have that much of an impact. On the standard shooter scheme or this remapped one, reload actually activates on release rather than press. It's kind of odd, but I don't see it being a huge deal. I will note that on the active press, the one that you actually need to time, yeah, that one actually happens on press, so you don't have to worry about that. As we look at the pros and cons for this game, it's kind of a toss-up. Having no delays would be pretty nice, but the sticky walls and non-stop roadie run are kinda killing it for me. So there you have it, 9 control schemes, all with their own pros and cons. Let us know down below, what schemes do you use and why? For those interested in the whole remapping discussion and controller settings, be sure to tune in tomorrow. I'll discuss most of the settings, remapping in-game, as well as remapping in the Xbox accessory app. A common question also revolves around what sensitivity is best and how the sliders work. All of that and more will come on Wednesday, and I gotta say I'm pretty excited about that video. Lastly, make sure to check back on Thursday. I'll take all of the learnings from this week's videos and compile them into what I believe is the ideal setting and control scheme for Gears of War. Make sure you drop this a like if you found it helpful. I'll see you all tomorrow, and thanks for watching.
Yes, please.
I'm gonna find whoever did that.